The promotion meeting lasted less than 1 minute, but it quietly detonated an entire company's future. They thought they were merely humiliating me, a loyal executive of 5 years, to clear the path and reward the chief executive officer's son. What they actually did was remove the only woman holding together a high-stakes renewal season worth hundreds of millions of dollars. My name is Hazel Gomez. I am 38 years old, and for the last 5 years, I have been the Senior Director of Strategic Accounts at Crestfall Critical Systems. We are a Gulf Coast infrastructure services company based out of Houston, Texas. If you walk past our glass headquarters downtown, you might assume we push paper or sell software, but our actual product is survival. We manage emergency power and cooling contracts for the entities that cannot afford to go dark when the power grid fails. My clients are sprawling hospital networks in Louisiana, massive data campuses in the Austin Tech Corridor, and municipal facilities across the entire southern edge of Texas. When a hurricane tears through the coast, or a winter freeze shuts down the state, I am the person who ensures the diesel generators fire up and the backup cooling towers keep the server racks from melting down. I am the invisible engine behind the growth of this company. That is not corporate arrogance. That is a measurable, undeniable fact. Over the past 5 years, I have lived on airplanes, slept in rental cars during Category 4 storms, and talked panicked hospital administrators off the ledge at 3 in the morning. I built a network of trust that cannot be quantified on a standard spreadsheet, yet it shows up in every quarterly earnings report. Just last month, I closed the books on the strongest retention year in the history of the division. I secured 100% renewal on our top-tier contracts, locking in hundreds of millions of dollars in guaranteed revenue for the next decade. Because of this flawless record, I was told this afternoon's meeting would be the final formality. After 5 years of holding the line, I was finally ascending to the role I had functionally been doing for the last 2 years. Vice President of Regional Operations. I had earned the title, the equity, and the authority. I had the track record. I had the loyalty of the clients. I walked down the carpeted hallway of the 50th floor with the quiet confidence of a woman who knows exactly what her labor is worth. The conference room felt wrong the exact second I crossed the threshold. In corporate life, you learn to read the temperature of a room before anyone speaks a single word. The air in the executive boardroom was heavy, stagnant, and entirely devoid of the celebratory energy that accompanies a promotion. There were 3 people waiting for me, positioned around the massive mahogany table like actors who had forgotten their blocking. Dana Pike, our Director of Human Resources, sat nearest to the door. Dana usually possessed a warm, aggressively practiced corporate cheerfulness, but today she looked far too still. Her hands were folded tightly over her closed laptop, and her shoulders were locked. Across from her sat Lydia Stokes, our Chief Financial Officer. Lydia was a woman who usually commanded a room with direct eye contact and sharp questions. But as I walked in, she suddenly found the blank margin of her yellow legal pad utterly fascinating. She refused to look up. Then there was Owen Barron, the Chief Executive Officer. Owen was standing near the head of the table, adjusting the cuffs of a tailored suit that looked far too expensive for a standard Tuesday afternoon. He did not smile with his eyes. He offered a tight, overly formal nod that immediately set off a warning bell in the back of my mind. "Hazel, please, take a seat," Owen said. His voice was pitched half an octave lower than usual, coated in a thick layer of forced executive gravity. I sat down in the leather chair opposite the projection screen. The leadership deck was already illuminated against the wall, and the moment I looked at the slide, the warning bell in my head turned into a siren. The title of the presentation read, Regional Growth and Structural Evolution. Below that, the screen was filled with data points that I recognized instantly. They were my numbers. There was the 99% uptime metric from the Bay Shore municipal crisis. There was the $45 million recovery win from the Norval Data Campuses account. I scanned the bullet points and saw entire sentences lifted verbatim from the strategy memos I had written at midnight just 3 weeks ago. It was a perfect summary of my intellectual property, my relationships, and my sleepless nights. Yet, as my eyes searched the glowing rectangle, I realized my name was practically erased. I was not listed as the architect of these victories. My name appeared only once, buried in a tiny 12-point font in the background of an organizational chart, labeled merely as execution support. Owen cleared his throat, commanding the room's attention, though he still avoided holding my gaze for more than 2 seconds at a time. "Hazel, first of all, I want to thank you," Owen began, pacing slowly at the front of the room. "The past 5 years have been a period of incredible growth for Crestfall Critical Systems. Your loyalty has been exceptional. Your maturity in handling difficult client escalations is something this entire executive team deeply appreciates." He paused, steepling his fingers. He sounded less like a man giving a promotion and far more like a man meticulously preparing to justify a betrayal. "As we look toward the future of the company," Owen continued, his tone slipping into a cadence of practiced corporate jargon, "we have to think about long-term structural alignment. We are entering a crucial refinancing cycle over the next 18 months. The board and the executive committee have been having some very difficult, very high-level conversations about the kind of leadership profile we need at the vice president level to signal stability to our financial partners." I did not interrupt him. I kept my face perfectly neutral, my hands resting lightly on the arms of my chair. I let him speak because the more he talked, the more the architecture of the lie revealed itself. He was using words like alignment, profile, and stability as a shield against competence, results, and merit. While Owen dragged out his polished monologue about corporate evolution, my gaze drifted to the center of the mahogany table. Right in front of Lydia's rigidly placed coffee cup, there was a second candidate folder. It was partially covered by a printed agenda, but the edge was clearly visible. It was printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock, a stark contrast to the standard white paper HR used for internal reviews. It had been prepared in advance. It was sitting right there, a physical manifestation of a decision that had already been locked into place long before I ever walked through the heavy glass door. They had taken my results, stripped my name from them, and packaged my success into a launch pad for someone else. I looked at Dana, who swallowed hard and kept her eyes locked on her screen. I looked at Lydia, who was gripping her silver pen so tightly her knuckles were white. Finally, I looked back at Owen, who was still wrapping his betrayal in the velvet language of corporate strategy. Before anyone could even finish the official script, before Owen could formally deliver the rejection he was dancing around, the mood in the room became absolute and unmistakable. This was not an interview. This was not a debate about qualifications. This was not even a choice. The silence from the HR director and the CFO screamed the truth louder than Owen's hollow speech ever could. I was sitting inside a carefully constructed piece of theater. It was a ceremony designed from the ground up to make an act of profound unfairness look orderly, documented, and legitimate. Owen stopped speaking right in the middle of a syllable. His posture collapsed inward, dropping just a fraction of an inch. As the heavy oak door of the executive boardroom swung open, there had been no polite knock. There had been no preliminary request for entry from an executive assistant. The brass handle simply turned, and the architecture of the room immediately reoriented itself around the two people who stepped across the threshold. In walked Celeste Barron, the wife of the chief executive officer. She moved with the terrifying, absolute stillness of a woman who had never once in her life been asked to wait in a lobby. She was dressed in a sharp, immaculately tailored charcoal blazer that whispered of quiet, intergenerational wealth. Her posture was a weapon. Behind her, stepping into the corporate sanctuary with the unearned, loose-limbed swagger of a man who had never been told no, was her son. Tyler Barron was in his late 20s, possessing the kind of aggressive, expensive polish that only comes from elite coastal business schools and a lifetime of zero consequences. He smelled of fresh cologne and raw entitlement. He had never run a field operation. He had never negotiated a high-stakes municipal contract while standing in the mud of a hurricane disaster zone. He was entirely fundamentally untested in the brutal reality of our industry. Celeste did not bother to sit down in any of the available leather chairs. She bypassed the empty seats and walked directly to the head of the mahogany table, placing her hands flat against the polished wood. She did not look at the Director of Human Resources. She did not look at the Chief Financial Officer. She looked directly at me, her eyes as cold and flat as a winter ocean. "We are making a pivot," Celeste announced. Her voice was perfectly calm, lacking any of the nervous justification Owen had been drowning in just moments before. She delivered the mandate with the casual authority of a monarch addressing a slightly inconvenient servant. As Owen was no doubt explaining, we are entering a major refinancing cycle. The board and our lending partners require a very specific narrative. To secure the capital we need, this company requires continuity, family alignment, and a modern growth image. For those reasons, the role of Vice President of Regional Operations will go to Tyler. She let the words hang in the sterile, air-conditioned air of the room. I slowly shifted my gaze from Celeste to her husband. Owen stood there, mute and diminished, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume he had borrowed for the afternoon. He did not challenge her. He did not offer a defense of the meritocratic process he had just been pretending to uphold. His silence was the most honest thing he had provided all day. It told me everything I needed to know about the true power structure of Crestfall Critical Systems. Owen might possess the Chief Executive Officer title on his email signature, but the boardroom, the company, and the future entirely belonged to the Barron family. Tyler stepped forward, pulling out the chair directly across from me. He sat down, unbuttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant flick of his wrist. He leaned forward, flashing a bright, aggressively white smile that did not reach his eyes. "Look, Hazel, you have done a tremendous job holding the fort." Tyler started, using a tone of voice one might use to praise a diligent administrative assistant who had successfully ordered the correct catering for a lunch meeting. "But the industry is shifting rapidly. We have to be aggressive. We need to focus on modernizing old relationship-driven management. Relying on an individual person's charm or their personal Rolodex to keep hospital networks and data campuses on board is an outdated, high-risk model. We need scalable systems. We need a visionary framework." I sat perfectly still, listening to a boy in his late 20s dismiss the agonizing, sleepless, blood and sweat labor of my last 5 years as old relationship-driven management. He was taking the human trust I had forged in the fires of actual emergencies, the late-night phone calls, the broken supply chains I had personally stitched back together, the frantic hospital directors I had promised to protect, and reducing it all to an obsolete, unscalable liability. He was attempting to make my competence sound like a corporate weakness. Celeste picked up seamlessly where her son left off, performing a flawless tactical maneuver designed to keep me firmly in my place. "Exactly," Celeste said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Hazel, we view your contributions as incredibly useful groundwork. You have poured important concrete. That is valuable. Yes, it is very important. But a foundation is just a foundation. It is merely something for the next tier of leadership to build upon. Tyler is going to step in now and elevate this entire division with his vision and his leadership." Useful groundwork. The phrase echoed in my mind, sharp and jagged. I took a slow, deep breath, maintaining absolute control over the muscles in my face. I broke eye contact with the Barons for a brief second to look down the table. Dana Pike, the Human Resources Director, was staring fixedly at a non-existent spot on her laptop keyboard, her jaw clamped shut. Lydia Stokes, the Chief Financial Officer, had lowered her eyes completely. Pretending to review a blank sheet of paper, their absolute, suffocating silence confirmed the final bitter reality of the ambush. Several people in this room had known this execution was coming for weeks. They had sat in meetings with me, approved my travel budgets, reviewed my successful client renewals, and watched me work myself to the bone, all while knowing my future had already been handed over to a spoiled heir. They had chosen their own comfort over my career. They had chosen not to warn me. The standard corporate expectation in a moment like this is emotional collapse. They wanted me to argue. They wanted me to raise my voice, to list my accomplishments, to demand fairness. If I became angry, I would become hysterical in their eyes. If I cried, I would prove I lacked executive emotional regulation. Any outburst would instantly retroactively justify their decision to pass me over. I refused to give them the weapon they desperately needed. I placed my hands flat on the arms of my leather chair and slowly stood up. I smoothed the front of my skirt, letting a full 5 seconds of dead silence stretch across the room. I looked directly at the son who had just stolen my future, and I offered him a calm, serene smile. "Congratulations, Tyler," I said. My voice was perfectly modulated, entirely smooth, and completely devoid of any underlying sarcasm or rage. The reaction was instantaneous. Tyler's arrogant smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. Celeste's eyes narrowed slightly. Owen shifted his weight uncomfortably from one foot to the other. My complete lack of outrage unsettled every single person in the room. I saw more than a screaming match ever could have. By refusing to fight for a game that was already rigged, I signaled that I had completely understood the board, the players, and the rules. I was no longer a participant in their illusion. I picked up my notebook, snapped my pen shut, and turned toward the door. I had my hand on the heavy brass handle when Tyler spoke again, his voice pitching up slightly, desperate to reclaim the authority my calmness had just stripped from him. "Hazel, wait," Tyler called out casually, as if remembering a minor administrative detail. "Obviously, I'm going to need you to stick close for a while. I need you to walk me through the key accounts and introduce me to the major players. I will be heavily relying on you to ensure we have a totally smooth transition over the next few months." I paused with my back to them, my hand gripping the cold metal of the door handle. In that final, quiet second, the true depth of their parasite strategy revealed itself. They did not merely want to deny me the role I had bled for. They did not just want to steal the title and the salary. They actually expected me to stay and actively build the throne they had just placed him on. They wanted to extract my intellectual property, drain my client goodwill, and use my undeniable competence to legitimize the completely unqualified son who had just taken my job. I did not turn around. I did not agree to his demand. I simply pushed the heavy oak door open, walked out into the brightly lit hallway of the 50th floor, and let the heavy door click firmly shut behind me. I walked into the massive glass atrium of the Crestfall Critical Systems headquarters at exactly 7:15 the following morning. The security guard at the marble front desk nodded to me, just like he did every other morning of the work week. I swiped my standard issue corporate badge, stepped into the stainless steel elevator, and rode up to the 50th floor without breaking my established, measured stride. The unwritten corporate playbook for an unexpectedly passed-over executive, particularly a woman, usually dictates one of two predictable paths: the sudden, mysterious sick day to hide the wound, or the hyper-aggressive overcompensation of forced smiles and loud laughter to prove she is unaffected. I chose neither of those paths. I walked into the division suite, poured my standard black coffee in the break room, sat down at my dual monitors, and opened my email inbox. There were no tears in the executive washroom. There was no whispered venting to sympathetic colleagues. There was absolutely no emotional collapse for human resources to quietly document as proof of my fundamental instability. I simply went back to my job. My morning was immediately consumed by the sprawling, high-stakes infrastructure of the Gulf Coast. At 8 o'clock, I initiated a 90-minute synchronization call with the facilities director at Gulf Meridian Health. We needed to finalize a secondary diesel generator deployment schedule ahead of a volatile tropical depression forming in the Atlantic. Right after disconnecting from that conference line, I had to untangle a complex, infuriating supply chain bottleneck for the Norval data campuses. Their primary facility required massive replacement cooling valves before a projected weekend heat wave, and the vendor was threatening a delay. I spent 2 hours aggressively negotiating the freight logistics until the valves were secured. By noon, I was carefully reviewing the preventive maintenance logs for the Bayshore Municipal Support account. I did not miss a single deadline. I did not drop a single email thread. More importantly, I did not let a fraction of an ounce of instability or resentment bleed into my voice during my client calls. The people on the other end of those telephone lines were responsible for keeping pediatric life support machines running and municipal water grids functional during catastrophic weather events. They did not care about the internal boardroom politics of the Barron family. They cared exclusively about reliability, and I delivered that reliability with the exact same ruthless, unbroken precision I had utilized for the last 5 years. Inside the building, however, the atmosphere was entirely different. Gossip in a corporate headquarters travels much faster than fiber optic data. By lunchtime, the quiet, uncomfortable glances started radiating across the floor. Junior account managers actively lowered their voices or stopped talking altogether when I walked past their cubicles. My direct peers approached my desk with agonizing theatrical caution, phrasing their operational questions carefully. They were clearly expecting me to radiate bitter hostility or boldly drop a resignation letter onto the middle of the table. They wanted the drama. They wanted to see the impenetrable armor crack. What they completely failed to understand was that I was already far beyond the initial sting of surprise. Anger is an utterly useless, fleeting emotion if it is not immediately harnessed into a concrete strategy. I was no longer thinking about the profound unfairness of the previous afternoon. I was entirely focused on the mechanics of consequence. The emergency response industry is a surprisingly small, highly interconnected ecosystem. It is built entirely on back-channel communication, deep vendor relationships, and mutual survival. We hear everything long before the executive suites draft their polished, official press releases. Within 3 days of the ambush in the boardroom, my desk phone began to ring with inquiries that had absolutely nothing to do with cooling valves or generator fuel metrics. Key clients began asking cautious, carefully worded questions. A senior hospital administrator from Louisiana casually asked me about our long-term leadership continuity. A seasoned procurement officer in Austin mentioned a vague rumor he had heard about internal restructuring and wanted to ensure my direct phone number was not going to change. They were sniffing the air for smoke, because industries built on mitigating disaster are always the first to sense when a foundation is quietly cracking. The absolute confirmation of Tyler's operational strategy arrived on Thursday afternoon. I received a quiet, unscheduled phone call from a former diesel supplier I had worked with intimately during the devastating statewide freeze 2 years ago. We exchanged the usual industry pleasantries before his tone dropped into a hushed, conspiratorial register. He told me he had just sat through a mandatory vendor alignment presentation led by our new vice president of regional operations. "Hazel, you need to know what he is showing people," the supplier said, his voice tight with discomfort. During that meeting, Tyler had unveiled his grand visionary roadmap for the upcoming storm season. The supplier described the presentation slides to me in excruciating, undeniable detail. It was my proprietary hurricane continuity playbook. Tyler had taken the exact staging protocols, the complex fuel rationing matrices, and the emergency communication trees I had painstakingly designed over 3 grueling storm seasons. He had stripped my name off the header, slapped a modern, aggressive font on the title slide, and presented it to our entire critical vendor network as his own strategic brilliance. He was not just taking my job and my title. He was actively wearing my competence like a borrowed suit to hide his own profound operational ignorance. Later that same evening, my personal cell phone illuminated on my kitchen counter with an unfamiliar number. The caller was an executive recruiter working explicitly on behalf of Summit Arc Response. They were a fast-growing, highly aggressive competitor that was expanding rapidly across the Gulf Corridor. The recruiter did not waste my time with generic networking pleasantries. She specifically referenced my division retention metrics, numbers that were supposed to be strictly internal, proving just how porous the walls of Crestfall Critical Systems had already become. Summit Arc was actively looking to fill a high-authority executive role, one with legitimate budget control, real structural power, and absolute regional autonomy. It was the exact position I had just been denied by Celeste and Owen Barron. The offer was a perfectly timed, highly lucrative lifeboat, but I did not lunge for it. Desperation makes a professional sloppy. I thanked the recruiter politely, asked her to forward their formal organizational chart, and told her I needed exactly 1 week to evaluate the current market landscape. I did not want to move impulsively out of a sense of wounded pride. I needed perfect timing, maximum negotiation leverage, and absolute structural clarity before I made my next move. When the call ended, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a glass of ice water and a heavily dog-eared, printed copy of my original Crestfall Critical Systems employment agreement. I read every single clause, subclause, and legal addendum. The Barron family demanded unlimited, unquestioning, blind loyalty from their employees, assuming we would all bleed for their legacy. But corporate contracts are written by highly pragmatic lawyers, not loyalists. The legal text on the page was beautifully rigid and completely devoid of emotion. My contract required exactly 30 days of clean, documented notice for a resignation. It required nothing more and nothing less. More importantly, I closely scanned the non-solicitation parameters. While I was strictly prohibited from actively poaching internal staff or directly stealing active, signed contracts, there was absolutely no language preventing my existing clients from contacting me of their own free will after my departure. If a massive hospital network or a billion-dollar data center decided their fundamental trust resided in me, rather than the corporate logo printed on their monthly invoice, Crestfall had no legal mechanism whatsoever to block them from reaching out to me at a new firm. By the end of that first week, the shape of the future was entirely terrifyingly clear. Tyler was busy shaking hands, hosting catered lunches, and presenting my life's work as his own genius. Celeste and Owen were undoubtedly congratulating themselves in their gated mansion on a seamless, bloodless transition of power. They assumed my silence was permanent submission. They assumed I had quietly accepted my role as the invisible, weight-bearing pillar supporting their son's unearned empire. I closed the thick employment contract and placed it neatly into a manila folder. I made one absolute, private decision in the quiet shadows of my kitchen. I would not give them the satisfaction of a spectacular explosion. I would not march into Owen's corner office and beg for a matching counteroffer. I would not demand the public credit they had so casually stolen from me. I would simply continue executing my job with flawless, terrifying perfection. And when I finally chose to leave, the catastrophic reality of my absence would do all the talking they could ever possibly handle. The formal offer from Summit Arc Response arrived in my personal inbox on a Tuesday evening, exactly 14 days after the boardroom ambush. It was a flawless piece of corporate literature. They were not offering me a glorified support role or an advisory title designed to keep me quiet. The contract clearly outlined the position of Vice President of Strategic Operations across the entire Gulf Corridor. It came with absolute authority over regional deployments, direct control over an operating budget of $40 million, and unilateral decision-making power for all emergency escalations. It was a weapon forged exactly to my specifications. I printed the 50-page document, read every single line in the quiet of my living room, and left it unsigned on my desk. I needed to finish my business at Crestfall Critical Systems first. The next morning, my calendar pinged with an urgent, mandatory executive alignment meeting. The location was the same mahogany boardroom on the 50th floor. When I walked in, the staging was aggressively familiar, though the atmospheric energy had shifted entirely from a mock execution to a presumptive coronation. Owen Barron was seated at the head of the table. Celeste Barron sat to his right, projecting an aura of total territorial control. Tyler was leaning back in his chair, spinning a gold pen, looking exactly like a man waiting for his subordinates to pay tribute. Dana Pike from Human Resources and Lydia Stokes from Finance were positioned exactly as they had been 2 weeks prior. A new addition was seated at the far end of the table, Marcus Vance, our lead corporate counsel. "Hazel, take a seat," Owen said, projecting a forced, highly collaborative warmth that made my skin crawl. We wanted to get everyone in the room to map out the next 90 days. Tyler has some incredibly ambitious restructuring plans for the division, and we need to establish a very rigid, comprehensive training timeline for you to bring him up to speed on the legacy accounts before renewal season hits. Tyler stopped spinning his gold pen and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. Right. I need you to build a full matrix of every municipal stakeholder and hospital procurement officer. I also want you shadowing my transition calls so we can project a unified front to the market. I need you to cushion the introductions so the clients feel secure. They were not asking for my help. They were assigning me the task of constructing my own obsolescence, block by block, ensuring the Barron family felt absolutely no friction from their nepotism. They assumed my presence in the building meant I had swallowed the humiliation and accepted my fate as their permanent safety net. I did not sit down. I unclasped my leather portfolio, extracted a single sheet of heavy bond paper, and slid it directly across the table into the empty space between the Chief Executive Officer and the Director of Human Resources. "That will not be possible," I said. My voice was as calm and level as a sheet of ice. "Please accept this as my formal letter of resignation. As per the strict stipulations of my employment contract, I am providing exactly 30 days of notice, effective immediately." The silence that fell over the boardroom was absolute. It was not the heavy, manufactured silence of the previous meeting. This was the sudden, breathless vacuum of a room that had just been violently stripped of its oxygen. Owen's face underwent a terrifying, rapid transformation. The polished, authoritative mask dissolved in real time, replaced by the naked panic of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on a trap door. He looked at the printed letter, then up at me, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. In that exact fraction of a second, Owen finally understood the math. Losing me was not a minor administrative inconvenience for human resources to smooth over. It was a massive, unmitigated operational exposure right at the edge of hurricane season, and he had absolutely no idea how he was going to explain this catastrophic vulnerability to the lenders or the board of directors. Celeste did not freeze. Her reaction was instantaneous and fiercely aggressive. She slammed her hand flat against the table, the sharp sound echoing off the glass walls. "Absolutely unacceptable," Celeste snapped. Her elegant composure fractured completely, revealing the sheer, unadulterated entitlement underneath. "Your accounts are entirely too valuable and complex to hand over in a month. You are managing hundreds of millions of dollars in critical infrastructure contracts. You cannot just walk away. We require a 3-month transition period. Minimum." She phrased it not as a negotiation, but as a royal decree. She fundamentally believed that her family owned my time and my expertise, simply because they demanded it. I turned my gaze away from Celeste and looked directly at the Director of Human Resources. "Dinah, could you please confirm the terms of my separation agreement for the room?" Dana swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously between Celeste's furious glare and the open personnel file on her laptop screen. "Hazel is fully compliant," Dana whispered, her voice trembling slightly under the crushing pressure of the room. "Her executive agreement only mandates a standard 30-day notice period for a voluntary resignation without cause. There are no stipulations requiring an extended holdover." At the edge of the table, Lydia Stokes remained completely silent. The chief financial officer did not look surprised, nor did she look angry. She stared straight ahead at the blank wall with the hollow, terrifying expression of a woman who was already mentally calculating the sheer scale of the financial disaster about to hit them. Lydia knew exactly what happens when you remove the single load-bearing pillar of a division right before a 9-figure refinancing cycle. The silence of a finance director is always the loudest warning in any corporation. Seeing that the aggressive, demanding approach was failing, Marcus Vance smoothly slid a thick legal document across the table toward me. "Hazel, we understand you are moving on," Marcus said, utilizing the deeply soothing, intensely patronizing tone corporate lawyers employ when they are actively trying to trap you. "However, given the sensitive nature of your operational knowledge, we need you to sign this transition acknowledgement. It simply outlines your ongoing duties to ensure Crestfall suffers no business interruption." I picked up the document and began to read the fine print. It was a masterpiece of vague, weaponized legal fiction. It contained highly subjective phrases like ongoing consultative liability and mandated that I remain responsible for mitigating post-exit failures. There was a deeply buried clause assigning me the explicit blame for any incomplete handoff risk or future client dissatisfaction. If a hospital network canceled their contract 6 months from now because Tyler ignored their phone calls, this document would give Crestfall the legal leverage to sue me for the resulting damages. They wanted me to serve as their permanent, legally bound scapegoat. I did not argue the legality of it. I did not act insulted by the transparent manipulation. I simply reached into my suit jacket, retrieved my heavy black fountain pen, and uncapped it. Right there, standing in front of the chief executive officer, his furious wife, the panicked heir apparent, and their lead attorney. I began to edit the document line by line. I pressed the metal nib hard into the paper, aggressively crossing out entire paragraphs of their vague, self-serving protection clauses. The sound of the pen scratching violently across the thick paper was the only noise in the room. I will not agree to ambiguous future liabilities, I stated clearly, my eyes fixed firmly on the page as I slashed through another section of indemnification text. I will provide a complete, indexed digital file of all active vendor contacts. I will finalize the compliance reports for the third quarter. I will attend exactly 2 transition calls per week, strictly limited to 1 hour each, scheduled entirely at my discretion. I turned to the final page, crossed out the broad non-disparagement and ongoing liability waiver, and wrote a single, definitive sentence in the bottom margin. My responsibilities, my liabilities, and my association with Crestfall Critical Systems end permanently and absolutely at 5 o'clock on the 30th day. I will sign nothing that suggests otherwise. I slid the heavily redacted, ink-stained document back across the table to Marcus. He looked at the ruined pages as if I had just handed him a live grenade with the pin already pulled. You are leaving us completely exposed. Tyler finally spoke. His voice cracked slightly, the arrogant veneer completely stripped away. He sounded exactly like a frightened boy who had broken an incredibly expensive machine and was terrified of the impending consequences. I am leaving you exactly what you asked for, I replied softly, looking directly into his panicked eyes. I am leaving you the title. The performance of that title is entirely up to you. The clock began ticking the exact second my resignation letter hit the polished mahogany table of the executive boardroom. 30 days. That was the precise, unalterable perimeter of my remaining existence within Crestfall Critical Systems. For Tyler Barron, however, that countdown was not a standard transition period. It was a frantic, desperate sprint to remodel the entire division before the board of directors and the external refinancing partners noticed the structural cracks. He desperately needed to project the immediate illusion of decisive visionary command. To achieve that optical illusion, he immediately began dismantling the very operational machinery that had kept the region highly profitable and perfectly stable for the last 5 years. Within 48 hours of my resignation becoming official, Tyler issued a division-wide mandate rapidly centralizing all emergency client escalations. He entirely eradicated the informal, direct call chains I had painstakingly built with regional facility directors over multiple hurricane seasons. In my system, if a critical hospital in Louisiana experienced a localized power grid failure at 2 o'clock in the morning, the facility manager did not have time to navigate a corporate web portal. They needed to call a specific human being who possessed the immediate, unilateral authority to reroute a massive diesel fuel truck that was already out on the highway. Tyler destroyed that trust-based network. Instead, he forced every single high-stakes crisis into a rigid, color-coded digital dashboard. He systematically replaced our highly customized, client-specific service calendars with standardized corporate templates. They looked absolutely beautiful on a high-resolution projection screen during executive briefings, but they entirely ignored the brutal, unpredictable field realities of our industry. You simply cannot standardize a response protocol for a coastal medical center facing a Category 4 hurricane and a landlocked municipal grid dealing with a freak winter freeze. The equipment is different, The access roads are different, and the failure cascades are different. Tyler did not understand those operational differences because he had never actually stood in the mud. He only understood how to format the presentation slides so they looked efficient to an accountant. The absolute peak of his corporate theater occurred exactly 1 week later during a mandatory division-wide town hall meeting. Hundreds of employees gathered in the main auditorium on the ground floor. Tyler took the center stage wearing a flawlessly tailored suit, clicking confidently through a glossy, high-production slide deck. He formally unveiled his brand-new operating model, proudly christening it the Barron Reliability Reset. I sat quietly in the fourth row, keeping my facial expression perfectly neutral as I watched him present my exact, proprietary storm response framework to the entire company. He had taken my escalation matrices, my vendor triage protocols, and my deeply complex fuel routing logistics, slapped a fresh corporate logo on them, and claimed them as his own executive innovation. He spoke in aggressive buzzwords that sounded incredibly impressive to banking partners but meant absolutely nothing to the actual technicians who wore hard hats and steel-toed boots. I slowly glanced around the auditorium. Several senior operational managers and veteran field directors were sitting just a few seats away from me. I saw the immediate, sharp recognition flash in their eyes. They recognized the architecture. They knew exactly whose sleepless nights and whose intellectual property they were looking at. A few of them subtly shifted in their seats, casting brief, highly uncomfortable glances in my direction. But absolutely no one raised a hand. No one challenged his blatant professional theft. The building had already deeply internalized the ultimate lesson of the family power structure. Silence is the only currency that gets rewarded when the chief executive officer's wife is managing the organizational chart. I did not interrupt his town hall presentation. I simply went back to my desk and continued executing my daily responsibilities with absolute, freezing professionalism. I handled my legally required transition calls, I forwarded the necessary compliance documentation, and I closed out the financial reporting for the third quarter. However, behind the firewall of my own meticulous record-keeping, I was privately building an impenetrable fortress of evidence. Every single time Tyler dismantled a functional process to feed his new dashboard, I documented it. Every time a critical client nuance was erased to fit neatly into his standardized slide deck, I logged the exact operational risk that erasure created. I created a secure encrypted folder on my local drive. Inside it, I placed time-stamped copies of the original, highly functional service agreements directly alongside Tyler's new, stripped-down templates. I was not plotting an act of corporate sabotage. I was strictly, forensically cataloging an impending collapse. The underlying reason for Tyler's frantic, glossy restructuring was quietly revealed to me by the one person who could no longer stomach the suffocating anxiety of the executive suite. Late on a Friday afternoon, Dana Pike walked over to my cubicle. The director of human resources looked utterly exhausted. The manufactured corporate cheerfulness completely drained from her face. She leaned heavily against my partition, speaking in a hushed, rapid whisper so the junior financial analyst nearby could not overhear the conversation. "They are terrified. Hazel," Dana murmured, her eyes darting nervously toward the glass corridor. "The lender scrutiny is intensifying rapidly. The private equity partners facilitating the refinancing cycle are demanding granular, documented proof of leadership stability. Owen explicitly promised the lending syndicate that the division transition would be utterly seamless. The board of directors is watching every single retention metric this month. If a major account even twitches, the banks might pull back their capital commitments. They will manage the risk," I replied softly, not looking away from my dual monitors. But the truly sharp twist arrived 2 days later, cutting through the sterile corporate atmosphere like a physical blade. I was on a strictly scheduled 15-minute transition call with the lead procurement officer at Gulf Meridian Health. We were concluding the standard vendor handover details when the client paused, his voice softening with genuine relief. "We are just really glad you are personally helping mentor the transition," the procurement director said, letting out a heavy breath. "Tyler mentioned on our executive alignment call yesterday that you two are working hand in hand, and that you are actively validating his new service models behind the scenes. It definitely makes the hospital board here feel a lot better about the sudden restructuring. My hands stopped moving across the keyboard. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the lie froze the blood in my veins. Tyler was not merely stealing my past work. He was actively hijacking my current professional reputation to pacify the very clients his arrogance was alienating. He was deliberately using my name as a human shield to cover his own glaring incompetence. He desperately needed the massive hospital networks and the municipal grids to believe I had given him my explicit blessing, because my blessing was the only currency the market actually trusted. He wanted my work, but he completely discarded my judgment, yet he still needed the market to believe my judgment was guiding his hand. I politely thanked the procurement officer, ended the call precisely on time, and immediately opened a blank corporate document. I did not march into Tyler's glass office to yell at him. I did not call Owen to complain about the unethical behavior. I utilized the single most devastating weapon available in any modern corporate environment: the indisputable, time-stamped paper trail. I drafted a highly precise, aggressively sterile legal memorandum. I did not use a single adjective, because adjectives imply emotion, and emotion implies a vulnerability that corporate lawyers can easily exploit. I addressed the document directly to Marcus Vance in the legal department, copying Dana Pike in human resources, and blind copying my own encrypted personal email address for permanent preservation. I explicitly outlined the exact, narrow parameters of my remaining duties as strictly defined by my previously edited separation agreement. I then clearly, factually, stated that I had not been consulted on, had not participated in the design of, and fundamentally did not endorse any of the operational parameters of the Barron Reliability Reset. I explicitly demanded that executive management immediately cease using my name, my likeness, or my professional reputation in any external client communications regarding the new service model, plainly stating that doing so constituted a severe misrepresentation of my professional judgment and exposed the company to extreme liability. I clicked the mouse and hit send. It was a flawless, surgical strike. By placing that specific document into the official legal and human resources archives of Crestfall Critical Systems, I made it structurally impossible for Owen, Celeste, or Tyler to ever claim I had approved of the impending operational disaster. When the standardized templates inevitably failed the clients, and when the rigidly centralized dashboards inevitably collapsed under the chaotic pressure of a real storm, they would have absolutely no legal or narrative avenue to blame me. I had formally, legally, and permanently detached my hard-earned reputation from his inevitable failure. The third week of my notice period brought a brutal, suffocating heat wave that settled over the entire Gulf Coast like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The ambient temperature spiked to 106 degrees in Houston and stayed locked there for 5 consecutive days. This was not merely uncomfortable weather. In the infrastructure services industry, extreme, sustained heat is a merciless structural stress test. It puts an agonizing, relentless strain on hospital cooling loads, municipal backup systems, and the delicate, highly sensitive redundancy plans of massive data campuses. For 5 years, I had managed these exact pressure cooker scenarios with quiet, invisible precision. I would monitor the regional grid loads, pre-position mobile cooling units, and authorize preemptive maintenance long before a single client ever felt a fluctuation in their facility's temperature. Now, I was strictly a silent spectator, watching Tyler pilot a massive, heavily loaded airplane he did not know how to fly straight into a Category 5 operational storm. The first major fracture happened on a Tuesday afternoon. One of the largest facilities in the Gulf Meridian Health Network experienced a critical, sudden failure in their secondary chiller plant. The internal temperature in their main surgical wing began creeping upward, threatening to force the immediate evacuation of 3 active operating rooms. The hospital facility director immediately defaulted to 5 years of operational muscle memory and bypassed the corporate switchboard entirely, calling directly down the old emergency phone tree I had established. The frantic call landed on the desk of a senior field coordinator, who immediately ran to Tyler's glass office to request emergency authorization to reroute a massive cooling trailer from a less critical site. Tyler refused the verbal request. He sat behind his oversized desk, completely detached from the physical, sweating reality of the crisis, and insisted that the hospital director formally submit an escalation ticket through the newly mandated digital portal. "We need process discipline," Tyler told the panicked field coordinator, casually adjusting his expensive cuffs. "If we circumvent the dashboard every single time a client panics, we lose all measurable control over our asset deployment. Tell them to log the request online." The facility director, managing an active, terrifying crisis with surgeons literally screaming in his ear, was forced to waste 20 precious minutes fumbling through a convoluted web form he had never seen before. The mobile cooling trailer eventually arrived, but the agonizing, entirely preventable delay caused the surgical wing's temperature to rise just enough to trigger a mandatory, automated shutdown of their advanced sterilization equipment. It did not cause a total catastrophe, and no patients were physically harmed, but it created a terrifying, deeply unforgivable near miss. It violently shook the hospital board's confidence. More importantly, it revealed the exact lethal danger of what happens when executive leadership fundamentally mistakes a rigid digital workflow for actual human trust. Less than 48 hours later, a completely different kind of disaster unraveled in real time. Tyler had been aggressively scrutinizing the regional labor budgets, desperate to show the finance department an immediate, measurable cost reduction before the impending refinancing deadline. He noticed a high volume of weekend overtime being paid to the field crews servicing the Bay Shore municipal accounts. Without consulting the historical operational logs or asking a single veteran manager, Tyler unilaterally approved a sweeping staffing change. He cut the overtime budget completely and replaced the veteran weekend crews with standard entry-level technicians. He looked at the spreadsheet and saw identical labor hours, completely failing to realize that those specific municipal sites required technicians holding highly specialized local government security certifications to even unlock the perimeter gates. When a scheduled, critical preventive maintenance rollout failed on Saturday morning because the replacement crews were legally barred from entering the facilities, the municipal grid operators hit the roof. They were left completely exposed and vulnerable during the absolute peak of the heat wave. The phones in the division suite began ringing constantly. The underlying questions from our major clients fundamentally shifted in tone. They were no longer asking if Crestfall Critical Systems possessed modern software or efficient dashboards. They were asking a much darker, much more dangerous question. When the software inevitably breaks down, does anyone left inside that building actually know what to do? The sheer, suffocating panic radiating from the executive floor finally culminated in one last, desperate attempt to keep me in the building. On the Monday of my final week, Celeste Barron bypassed her husband completely and summoned me to a private, heavily guarded conversation in a vacant executive suite. She knew Owen was paralyzed by the impending disaster, so she took the reins to protect her son's collapsing narrative. She slid a thick, legally binding document across the polished table. It was a revised compensation package offering me a massive, almost unprecedented retention bonus and a staggering bump in my base salary. It was an astonishing amount of money. However, as I calmly scanned the heavy paper, I noted exactly what was missing. There was absolutely no promotion to vice president. There was no actual structural authority granted to me. There was absolutely no contractual promise that Tyler would stop overriding my safety protocols or using my professional reputation as a human shield for his own catastrophic mistakes. "We value you," Celeste said. Her voice was incredibly tight with suppressed anxiety, desperately attempting to manufacture a maternal warmth that rang entirely hollow. "We want you to stay here and be the highest-paid director in the entire company. Tyler needs a seasoned, experienced advisor to help him navigate the season." I slowly placed the contract back onto the table and pushed it an inch away from me. "I am not an advisor," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of anger or pride. and my professional judgment is not for sale as an insurance policy. I decline the offer." Her face hardened instantly into a mask of pure glacial fury, but I simply stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked out of the room. I spent my final 3 days completing every single promised handoff with immaculate, terrifying professionalism. I uploaded every necessary file, indexed every vendor contact, and finalized every compliance report down to the very last decimal point. I left behind digital and physical records so pristine, so comprehensively detailed, that no corporate lawyer or panicked executive could ever plausibly point to my departure as the root cause of their impending collapse. I handed them a perfectly clean slate, knowing full well they did not possess the competence to keep it clean for more than a week. On my very last afternoon, as I was placing my few personal belongings into a small cardboard box, my desk phone rang for the final time. It was the lead procurement director from one of our oldest and most lucrative municipal accounts. I answered with my standard, even professional greeting. The man on the other end of the line did not ask about cooling valves, maintenance schedules, or transition dashboards. He spoke in a quiet, deeply measured voice that felt exactly like a solemn warning. "I heard today is your final day," he said slowly, pausing to let the weight of the moment settle. "I just wanted to make one thing absolutely clear before you walk out of that building for good. We signed our original contract with Crestfall Critical Systems because of the company. We stayed for the last 5 years because of you." I walked into the modern, sunlit headquarters of Summit Arc Response on a Monday morning, exactly 2 days after my required notice period ended at Crestfall Critical Systems. For the very first time in my professional career, I was handed an executive title that perfectly matched the massive weight of responsibility I already knew how to carry. I was officially the Vice President of Strategic Operations for the Gulf Corridor. I possessed absolute structural authority. I controlled a regional budget of $40 million, and I held the unilateral power to hire, structure, and deploy emergency resources exactly as I saw fit. I did not have to justify my field strategies to a terrified chief executive officer, nor did I have to massage the fragile ego of an unqualified heir just to get a basic maintenance schedule approved. I immediately began building my new division around the core principles that actually matter in disaster management: absolute mechanical reliability, a ruthless internal escalation culture, and deeply embedded field intelligence. I explicitly instructed my newly formed leadership team that we would not raid Crestfall for their veteran operational staff. I refused to violate a single clause of my non-solicitation agreement, and I strictly forbade my account executives from making any proactive sales calls to the restricted legacy clients I had left behind. I drew a hard, unshakable ethical line, not because I feared Marcus Vance and his corporate legal department, but because I simply did not need to cheat to win. I finally had the financial backing and the organizational power to conquer the market the right way. However, in the high-stakes world of emergency infrastructure, gravity always does the heavy lifting for you if you wait long enough. I did not have to solicit anyone. As the third quarter came to a close and the standard renewal windows began to open, a fascinating, entirely passive momentum shift occurred. Former clients began reaching out to my direct office line completely of their own volition. In a business where human lives and billions of dollars in data rely on absolute certainty, instability is a terrifying poison. When the backup generators fail to start, facility managers do not care about the glossy corporate logo printed on the side of the truck. They remember the exact name of the human being who previously kept their facilities alive during the darkest storms. The first quiet structural shift in the market happened with Bayshore Municipal. Tyler Barron's disastrous decision to cut the weekend field authority layers to save a fraction of a percent on the quarterly labor budget had deeply rattled the city planners. The municipal grid operators realized they could no longer guarantee that a certified, senior-level technician would actually be dispatched during a Sunday afternoon crisis. They did not announce a dramatic, public breach of their master service agreement with Crestfall. Instead, they utilized a standard operational loophole. They simply began routing all of their uncontracted overflow emergency response volume directly to Summit Arc. It started as a trickle of small, localized repair tickets, but within 4 weeks, we were managing nearly 30% of their total weekend operational load. It was a silent, devastating bleed of high-margin revenue that Tyler's newly centralized digital dashboard was completely incapable of tracking. Then, the massive structural earthquake hit. Gulf Meridian Health, the absolute crown jewel of my former regional portfolio, formally invited Summit Arc Response to submit a highly competitive bid for their upcoming master service renewal. I learned the exact context of this invitation during a quiet, off-the-record lunch with their senior procurement director. He looked exhausted, aggressively stirring his black coffee before explaining the sheer magnitude of the disaster Tyler had caused. The hospital network had requested a routine, high-level executive meeting with Crestfall to discuss the rigid state compliance timing required for their surgical wing backups ahead of the new regulatory year. Tyler, completely lacking the operational vocabulary to understand the complex nuances of medical facility regulations, panicked during the boardroom presentation. He fundamentally confused their deep inquiries about life safety compliance timing with a standard negotiation about pricing strategy. He actively tried to sell us a 10% volume discount, the procurement director told me, shaking his head in profound disbelief. We were asking him how his team planned to legally certify our secondary power grids before the state health inspectors arrived in November, and he tried to offer us a coupon. It was terrifying. He did not even understand the basic regulatory laws governing the machines he is supposed to be maintaining. His profound ignorance actively alarmed the entire operations team at Gulf Meridian. They realized instantly that the man holding the keys to their survival viewed them entirely as numbers on a financial ledger. Completely detached from the physical reality of patient care, we submitted our proposal. Summit Arc officially won our very first municipal overflow contract less than 60 days into my tenure. It was a modest victory on paper, but it proved to the entire southern market that my new division was fully operational and ruthlessly effective. 3 weeks later, we secured a much larger, highly symbolic regional data center contract that had historically belonged exclusively to Crestfall for the past decade. We were rapidly turning my hard-earned personal credibility into undeniable institutional growth, proving that market dominance could be achieved without taking a single unethical shortcut. The emergency services sector in Houston is a deeply interconnected, highly communicative ecosystem. The internal fallout inside the glass walls of Crestfall could not be contained. Through the tight-knit network of veteran vendors and specialized subcontractors, the reality of their internal panic became entirely clear to the wider market. Inside the 50th floor boardroom, Tyler continuously insisted to his father and the board of directors that the sudden client churn was entirely temporary. He aggressively spun the narrative, claiming the revenue drops were merely an overblown, expected side effect of modernizing a legacy system, and promised that the numbers would totally stabilize by the fourth quarter. But Lydia Stokes was no longer sitting silently and staring at her blank legal pad. The chief financial officer was finally looking at a widening, undeniable pattern of revenue erosion that aggressive corporate accounting tricks could no longer smooth over. The profit margins were shrinking rapidly, the critical retention metrics were plunging, and the massive refinancing cycle was looming just weeks away. Lydia saw the raw mathematics of nepotism laid bare on her balance sheets. Sitting in my spacious, quiet office overlooking the downtown skyline, I reviewed the finalized, fully executed master service agreement for Gulf Meridian Health. I ran my hand over the heavy paper and experienced a profound, quiet realization. The industry was not moving my way because of petty revenge. It was not shifting because of rampant industry gossip. Nor was it moving out of some misplaced sense of sympathy for a wronged female executive. The multi-million-dollar contracts were migrating for one very simple, utterly ruthless reason. Trust, once violently broken by arrogance, immediately starts searching the horizon for the exact person who originally earned it. I had spent 5 agonizing, sleepless years earning that trust in the mud and the storms. Now, the market was simply finding its way back home. The official notification that Gulf Meridian Health was entirely severing its relationship with Crestfall Critical Systems, detonated on the 50th floor on a Thursday morning. In the emergency infrastructure industry, massive corporate collapses are never kept secret for long. Panicked vendors talk, aggressive recruiters gossip, and terrified former colleagues leak documents in a desperate bid to save their own reputations. Even from my new executive office across the city, the shockwave of their failure was impossible to miss. The timing of the contract cancellation was nothing short of catastrophic. Owen Barron was sitting right in the middle of a massive $300 million refinancing negotiation with a syndicate of highly aggressive private equity lenders. These financial institutions do not lend capital based on legacy, shiny corporate presentations, or family names. They underwrite risk based entirely on predictable, guaranteed contract retention. Gulf Meridian was the absolute cornerstone of the regional division. When that anchor suddenly snapped, the entire financial projection model Owen had confidently presented to the banking syndicate instantly turned into a work of corporate fiction. The fallout was immediate and absolutely brutal. The lead underwriters for the lending syndicate abruptly paused the capital authorization process, closed their leather binders, and demanded an emergency executive alignment meeting. They brought a very different, deeply terrifying set of questions into the boardroom. They were no longer asking about broad market trends or potential growth sectors. They aggressively zeroed in on leadership credibility and internal succession planning. The lead banker looked directly across the mahogany table at Owen and demanded to know exactly why the single most valuable operational director in the entire southern region had been allowed to walk out the front door just 30 days before the most critical contract renewal season in the last 10 years. Owen attempted to smoothly spin my departure as a mutual parting of ways, framing it as a natural evolution of the corporate structure designed to modernize the division. The lenders did not believe a single word of it. They looked at the plunging retention metrics and recognized a profound structural lie. The intense, suffocating external pressure from the banks finally broke the internal silence of the executive suite. Lydia Stokes, the chief financial officer, had spent her entire tenure quietly smoothing over the minor financial indiscretions of the Barron family. But she recognized that this was not a minor accounting error. This was a fatal, division-wide collapse. Knowing the board of directors would eventually demand a forensic, third-party audit, Lydia quietly bypassed the chief executive officer entirely. Late on a Friday evening, she opened the sealed human resources archives and pulled the original, finalized executive succession scorecards from the previous quarter. The documentation was utterly devastating. According to the company's own strictly mandated evaluation metrics, I had ranked first by an incredibly wide margin. My file contained a flawless 99% score on operational readiness, perfect marks in client retention, and peerless reviews in crisis management. Tyler Barron's evaluation column was functionally blank. He possessed absolutely no meaningful operational qualifications, no field deployment experience, and no verified metric of success. The math could no longer be manipulated. Lydia realized she was holding documented proof of a fraudulent executive appointment that was actively destroying the financial health of the company. Dana Pike was also actively preparing her own legal life raft. The director of human resources knew perfectly well that when the company finally faced a shareholder lawsuit, the Barron family would desperately try to blame the administrative staff for executing a flawed hiring process. To protect herself from massive civil liability, Dana quietly exported a highly sensitive, deeply incriminating chain of emails to a secure external hard drive. The messages were entirely from Celeste Barron. They provided a crystal-clear, time-stamped record of the chief executive officer's wife aggressively pressuring the human resources department to accelerate the interview timing. Celeste had actively shaped the internal narrative weeks in advance, dictating the exact corporate buzzwords that would be used to justify pushing me out. The emails definitively proved that Celeste had effectively decided the promotion and commanded the transition long before any formal evaluation of the candidates was even authorized to begin. It was a completely rigged game, and Dana had the digital receipts to prove she was merely acting under extreme duress. As the financial foundation violently cracked, another incredibly ugly operational surprise surfaced from the field. Right before a massive, late-season tropical storm threatened the Louisiana coastline, the regional supply managers requested emergency authorization to release funds for reserve diesel fuel and backup generator rentals. The emergency accounts were entirely empty. Tyler had quietly redirected over $2 million of the division's emergency reserve budget into a highly branded client experience initiative. He had hired a luxury consulting firm to redesign the digital portals, purchased high-end, embossed corporate gifts for hospital administrators, and ordered completely useless, fragile digital tablets for the field technicians. The initiative looked incredibly impressive when projected onto a boardroom screen, but it completely eradicated our actual field response flexibility. When the warning sirens started ringing in the coastal municipalities, the technicians had beautiful new software overlays, but absolutely no emergency fuel to keep the hospital life support grids running. He had traded actual survival for the illusion of modern efficiency. This toxic combination of financial panic and terrifying operational paralysis triggered an immediate, devastating exodus of institutional knowledge. Within the exact same month, two highly respected, veteran mid-level field managers submitted their immediate resignations. They did not leave quietly, and they did not accept the standard severance packages. During their mandated exit interviews, both managers explicitly refused to sign the standard non-disparagement agreements. They privately cited the suffocating daily chaos, the constant, aggressive blame-shifting from their unqualified new vice president, and a deeply toxic company culture where absolute family preference systematically outranked proven, life-saving judgment. They firmly stated they refused to be held legally responsible when a major medical facility inevitably went dark because a 20-something executive wanted to save a fraction of a percent on the weekend overtime budget. Their sudden departures severely crippled the remaining operational capacity of the division, leaving Tyler completely isolated. The cascading series of unmitigated failures finally forced the hand of the board of directors. A specialized governance subcommittee initiated a quiet, highly confidential internal review. The initial scope of their investigation was supposed to be strictly limited to the unusual account erosion and the paused refinancing cycle. However, the deeper the corporate attorneys looked, the more the entire architecture of the Barron family's deception unraveled in front of them. They found the drastically mismatched meeting records. They uncovered the altered performance metrics that Tyler had used to steal my proprietary storm response frameworks. The most chilling piece of evidence they discovered was the finalized, heavily redacted separation agreement resting at the bottom of my personnel file. The lead corporate attorneys on the board immediately recognized the aggressive, weaponized legal language Marcus Vance had attempted to force upon me. They read my strict, handwritten corrections, noting how I aggressively crossed out every single clause assigning me post-exit liability. The board members realized exactly what the executive team had tried to do. They understood that Owen and Celeste had deliberately positioned me to serve as the permanent, legally bound scapegoat for their son's inevitable, highly predictable failure. In a desperately convened, closed-door session, Owen stood before the oversight committee and attempted one final time to defend his son. His voice was trembling, entirely stripped of all its former polished, executive authority. He tried to frame Tyler's disastrous tenure as a bold leadership investment, pleading with the board for just 3 more months to let the modern growth image take root in the market. But the board members simply looked at the plunging revenue charts, the missing emergency reserves, the furious termination letters from the departing hospital networks, and the undeniable proof of a rigged succession process. The more the financial numbers worsened, the clearer the ultimate truth became to every single person sitting in that room. This was never an ambitious corporate restructuring. It was never about modernizing a legacy system. It was a massive, catastrophic governance failure entirely disguised as a legitimate leadership succession, and the Barron family's power could no longer control the widening fallout. The governance subcommittee of the board of directors did not launch a loud, highly public inquiry. In the corporate world, true panic is almost always completely silent. They moved with the terrifying, hushed precision of a surgical strike. Over the course of 14 days, they converted a secure, heavily soundproofed conference room on the 52nd floor into a closed-door deposition chamber. The details of their internal investigation were eventually entered into the formal corporate record during the subsequent legal proceedings, which is exactly how I learned the precise, devastating anatomy of their downfall. The board subpoenaed Dana Pike from Human Resources, Lydia Stokes from Finance, Marcus Vance from the Legal Department, and half a dozen mid-level operational executives connected to the third quarter promotion cycle. The Barons had desperately built their entire corporate defense on the flimsy premise that a few disgruntled employees were merely resisting a necessary visionary modernization. But as the sworn testimonies piled up on the long mahogany table, the narratives began to align with a rigid, undeniable perfection that Owen and his wife could no longer manipulate or spin. The very first crack in the Baron family defense came directly from the digital archives. The forensic auditors retrieved the original metadata-stamped versions of the executive alignment summaries from the first and second quarters. They compared those secure, hidden files against the polished, official reports Tyler had submitted to the board to justify his own rapid ascension. The discrepancy was not a matter of subjective interpretation. It was blatant, documented forgery. Tyler had not just altered one meeting summary, he had gone back through 6 months of strategic alignment records. He carefully deleted my name from the authorship metadata of the highly successful municipal retention strategy. More aggressively, he had rewritten the internal meeting minutes to falsely state that I actively preferred to remain in a highly supportive but non-strategic capacity. He literally typed a fictional narrative portraying me as a deeply loyal, subservient workhorse who completely lacked the executive ambition necessary for the vice president role. The forensic accounting team easily tracked his digital footprint, noting the exact hour he made the alterations, which happened to be just 48 hours before the formal promotion announcement in the boardroom. Dana Pike, absolutely terrified of being personally indicted in a massive shareholder lawsuit, stopped protecting the family and immediately started protecting herself. During her closed-door interview, the Director of Human Resources slid a thick stack of printed, time-stamped personnel logs across the table to the investigating committee. The notes detailed a series of highly irregular, undocumented mandates. They unequivocally proved that I was never once given a fair or legitimate evaluation process. The logs explicitly outlined the family's true expectation. I was to be systematically passed over, yet meticulously managed and kept agreeable so I could serve as a permanent, highly competent shock absorber for Tyler's inevitable landing. Dana's notes showed she was ordered to explicitly delay my performance review so Tyler could secure his title before I had a chance to formally document my quarterly wins. Lydia Stokes delivered the killing blow to Owen's professional credibility. The chief financial officer possessed the cold, mechanical detachment of an executive watching a highly predictable car crash. She presented the board with 3 distinct, heavily documented risk assessment memos she had personally delivered to the chief executive officer a full 90 days before the promotion cycle began. Her financial warnings were stark and completely devoid of ambiguity. Lydia had mathematically modeled the exact cost of replacing the Gulf Meridian health revenue stream. She had explicitly repeatedly advised executive leadership that they absolutely must not destabilize the key regional accounts right before the massive refinancing quarter, warning that a failure to renew would instantly breach the debt covenants of their impending agreement. Owen had simply ignored the catastrophic financial warnings entirely. He had replied to her detailed 50-page risk assessment with a single dismissive sentence, instructing her to trust the family vision. Confronting the reality of the balance sheet meant he would have to confront Celeste, and his cowardice was far stronger than his fiduciary duty to the company. But the ugliest most profound truth did not come from a forged meeting minute or a suppressed financial spreadsheet. It was unearthed directly from the corporate servers that hosted Celeste Barron's private messaging channels. The forensic team pulled hundreds of direct communications between the chief executive officer and his wife. In those digital conversations, the final veneer of Celeste's elegant, corporate sophistication was completely stripped away. She did not express concern over my lack of vision or my inability to scale the division. She expressed the exact opposite. She viewed my flawless track record as a severe structural threat. She sent messages from the back of her chauffeured car complaining that a vice president must be fiercely loyal to the family name first and the client second, a standard she knew I would never accept. She explicitly described me as entirely too competent, far too fiercely independent, and therefore much too difficult for her son to ever successfully control once I possessed formal, autonomous executive power. She wrote that allowing me to control the regional budget would make me completely untouchable. I was not passed over because I was incapable. I was actively neutralized because I was undeniable. Once the internal rot was fully exposed, the board of directors officially reached out to me. A senior partner from their outside legal counsel called my direct line at Summit Arc Response. He did not ask me to testify, and he did not attempt to negotiate. He respectfully requested my personal records from the transition period to complete their governance audit. I did not gloat, and I did not demand a formal apology. I simply opened my encrypted local drive and sent them a single, perfectly organized digital file. It contained my original resignation letter, the heavily redacted and strictly corrected transition acknowledgement that I had forced Marcus Vance to accept, and the comprehensive, rigidly dated logs of every single operational and process risk I had flagged before I walked out the door. The committee reviewed my documentation in total silence. When the outside legal counsel opened my file, they did not find the emotional manifesto of a bitter former employee. They found a chillingly precise autopsy of a division that was being deliberately suffocated. My records were perfectly calm, meticulously factual, and absolutely devastating. They provided indisputable chronological proof that I had fulfilled every single metric of my professional duty. The board read my handwritten corrections on the transition memo, clearly seeing where I had surgically removed their transparent attempts to make me the legal scapegoat for Tyler's future incompetence. They looked at the time-stamped warnings I had issued regarding the highly dangerous removal of the weekend municipal field crews. The contrast was blinding. On one side of the mahogany table, the board had a mountain of forged documents, suppressed financial warnings, and petty, paranoid text messages from the chief executive officer's wife. On the other side, they had my quiet, immaculate, and devastatingly accurate professional record. My documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I had warned the executive team clearly about the specific, catastrophic dangers of their actions, and that the only thing I had refused to provide was the vague, weaponized legal protection they desperately wanted to wrap themselves in to hide their impending failures. Sitting in that secure room, looking at the undeniable evidence, the governance committee finally realized the true scale of the corporate crime. The real scandal was not merely a predictable common tale of nepotism. It was not just that the incredibly entitled wife of the chief executive officer had forced her unqualified son into a critical role. The absolute, unforgivable breach of fiduciary duty was that the entire executive apparatus of Crestfall Critical Systems had knowingly staged a massive, elaborate lie. They had deliberately constructed a fraudulent corporate narrative, actively risked the survival of major medical networks and municipal grids, and then desperately tried to wrap their catastrophic negligence inside the armor of my own hard-earned professionalism. They had attempted to steal my reputation to underwrite their fraud, and the clean paper trail I left behind was the exact weapon that tore their entire illusion to shreds. The absolute climax of the Barron family's manufactured empire arrived on a Tuesday morning, right in the middle of the final, critical week of the third quarter. This was the exact week the massive refinancing package was scheduled to formally close. Instead of a celebratory press release announcing a secured financial future, the corporate markets received a very different, highly alarming notification. The lending syndicate officially withdrew their term sheets. The capital dried up instantly, evaporating the moment the external bankers reviewed the catastrophic retention metrics from the Gulf Meridian Health account. Within hours of the lenders pulling their hundreds of millions of dollars in capital, the Crestfall Critical Systems Board of Directors convened an emergency closed-door session. There were no polished presentations allowed in that room. and there was no space left for Owen to attempt one of his soothing, heavily rehearsed executive monologues. The Independent Governance Subcommittee took total, uncompromising control of the table. They laid out the exact, irrefutable timeline of the collapse, directly connecting the manipulated, fraudulent promotion cycle to the devastating erosion of the regional contracts, the blatant internal governance violations, and the deeply entrenched leadership deception. The execution of the executive team was swift, highly public, and absolutely bloodless. By 4 o'clock that same afternoon, Owen Barron was formally forced to tender his immediate resignation as Chief Executive Officer. He was not given a dignified transition period, nor was he allowed to release a statement framing his exit as an early retirement to spend more time with his family. He was simply and unceremoniously removed. Tyler Barron, the visionary heir who had spent the last 2 months systematically destroying my 5 years of meticulous labor, was terminated entirely for cause. Because his termination was strictly categorized under gross negligence and professional misconduct, he was immediately stripped of his unvested corporate equity and his lucrative golden parachute. He walked out of the glass building with absolutely nothing but the expensive suit on his back. The board of directors did not stop with the executives who actually drew a salary. They issued a legally binding structural mandate that formally barred Celeste Barron from ever holding any advisory, informal, or family-influenced role that touched company operations. The absolute, terrifying power she had wielded from the leather-back seat of her chauffeured car was permanently, legally revoked. The entire Barron family was surgically excised from the living tissue of the company they had treated as their own personal, consequence-free playground. The immediate aftermath left the remaining board of directors staring directly into a terrifying operational abyss. They authorized immediate outside governance oversight, bringing in highly paid external restructuring experts to stop the bleeding. But forensic accountants do not know how to route emergency diesel fuel during a coastal hurricane, and corporate auditors cannot convince a panicked hospital administrator to sign a 10-year master service agreement. In their quiet, suffocating desperation, the board reached out to the only person who actually possessed the capacity and the credibility to fix the broken machinery. My office phone at Summit Arc Response rang late on a Thursday afternoon. The caller identification displayed the direct and private line of the lead independent director of the Crestfall board. I let the phone ring exactly 3 times before I calmly picked up the receiver. The board member sounded incredibly exhausted, his voice completely stripped of the standard, insulated corporate arrogance. He did not attempt to negotiate aggressively, nor did he offer any empty, meaningless platitudes. He formally apologized for the profound failure of institutional governance that had allowed the Barron family to completely hijack the promotion cycle. Then, he presented his desperate, final offer. The board wanted to bring me back as an independent executive consultant. They offered a staggering sum of money, a completely open checkbook, and absolute, unchecked autonomy, practically begging me to guide them strictly through the impending, highly volatile crisis of the 4th quarter renewal season. I listened to his entire pitch in complete silence. I let him outline the massive compensation package and the sweeping executive authority they were finally, desperately willing to hand me. I appreciate the transparency, and I fully understand the extremely difficult position the board of directors is currently facing, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and immaculately professional. However, I must formally decline the offer. Hazel, we are prepared to double the consulting fee right now, the board member pleaded, the raw desperation finally cracking through his composed exterior. We simply need your operational oversight to stabilize the region before the next storm hits. You do not lack operational oversight, I explained softly, looking out the large, sunlit glass window of my new executive office. You lack trust. What the Barron family lost was never just my labor or my time. They lost the fundamental trust of the market. I cannot consult for you because trust does not return on command, and it certainly cannot be purchased with a lucrative consulting contract. I wish you the absolute best of luck with the restructuring process. I placed the receiver gently back onto the cradle, ending the connection to Crestfall Critical Systems forever. My ultimate victory did not happen in a loud, dramatic boardroom confrontation. It happened quietly, steadily, and undeniably. Just 2 weeks after the Barron family was escorted out of their headquarters, Summit Arc Response officially won the master service agreement for the entire Gulf Coast Unified Municipal Grid. It was the single largest infrastructure contract of my entire professional career, heavily dwarfing the combined revenue of my previous legacy accounts. We did not win the massive account through corporate sabotage, underhanded whispers, or aggressive price gouging. We won it simply because the market finally saw my operational leadership directly attached to a company that fundamentally respected and supported it. The landscape of the industry shifted permanently. Dana Pike, completely exhausted by the toxic anxiety of the past year, quietly resigned from her role as Director of Human Resources and accepted a position at a much healthier, highly stable logistics firm in Austin. Lydia Stokes remained at Crestfall, choosing to stay just long enough to stabilize the financial reporting for the external auditors, viewing it as her grim, final fiduciary duty before she too planned her inevitable exit. As for the Barron family, they became a dark, lasting cautionary tale. Their family name was no longer spoken with reverence or fear. It became a sharp industry warning, a story executives only mentioned in lowered voices when discussing the lethal dangers of unchecked nepotism and unearned arrogance. On a quiet Friday morning, I walked out of my office and strolled across the sprawling operations floor of my new division. The massive digital screens on the wall displayed real-time weather tracking, active field deployment metrics, and live grid loads across 3 states. The room was humming with the quiet, highly focused energy of veteran professionals executing high-stakes logistics. I stood there, watching my new team work seamlessly together, and I felt something I had never once experienced in my 5 grueling years at Crestfall. I felt the deep, unshakable grounding of power that perfectly matched my heavy accountability. I finally had the respect of my peers, the deep loyalty of the market, and the absolute authority to lead my division. And absolutely none of it was conditional on the fleeting, paranoid approval of a wealthy family. The story ends on the deepest, most satisfying revenge of all. The vice president promotion they so casually denied me in that sterile boardroom did not stop my rise. It merely redirected my path, while simultaneously exposing their empire as nothing more than a hollow, unearned inheritance, entirely too fragile to survive the brutal and demanding reality of the world. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support the channel even more by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.